Good morning, students. Yesterday we started the chapter Thinkers, Beliefs, and Buildings, and we also discussed in some detail about why 600 years before Christ and 600 years after him are quite landmark 1000 years in the world history when it comes to great cultural developments and about the great thinkers. And we also delved into the fact that yes, once humans had evolved and they had moved and graduated from being hunters and gatherers and pastoralists, and had actually started venturing into different facets of life, which provided them with a greater amount of stability and a greater amount of predictability about their own lives, when most of their necessities had been taken care of, where the life had become far more dependable and predictable, where they always now knew that where the next meal would come from. Then they started concentrating on the other vital aspects of life, which were about the age questions. Age questions would mean that is the questions which have always bothered human beings, but probably they were the first ones. Then that's why these years are very, very monumental, and they were probably the first ones who laid the foundations of these questions in different cultures. And as I said, though we are talking about here in the Indian perspective and context, mainly about the great Brahminical scholars and Jain scholars and the Buddhist scholars, but you have to understand that a similar kind of revolution, about the thought revolution and the philosophical revolution, was also happening in the other ancient civilizations, in Japan, in China. It was during these years, which were very, very formative years, when all this churning was happening, even in their own respective cultures. And whether you talk about, even for that matter, the Roman civilization at that point in time, I would not say Iranian, because that started, at least Islam and everything started happening 600 years AD, and that is why they have really stopped here at 600 AD. They haven't ventured beyond it. Okay, but the greatest of the Greek philosophers and the Roman philosophers and the lawmakers, all of them all of them were most productive, even in those ancient civilizations, at these very points. And Jesus Christ and all of them, all of them came around this period in time. Yeah, so that's why these years are extremely important and crucial. So today we start with a glimpse of Sanchi. We would be studying about the Sanchi Stupa. In 19th century, Europeans were very interested in the stupa at Sanchi. In fact, the French sought Shahjahan Begum's permission to take away the eastern gateway, which was the best preserved, to be displayed in a museum in France. For a while, some Englishmen also wanted to do the same, but fortunately, both the French and the English were satisfied with carefully prepared plaster cast copies, and that is the duplicate copies. Students, essentially, you first make the mold, the plaster mold, and then you put in the solution, and it then takes the shape, but it is as good as original. So that's what they are talking about here. And the original remained at the site, part of the Bhopal state. The rulers of Bhopal, Shah Jahan Begum and her successor, Sultan Jahan Begum, provided money for the preservation of the ancient site. And no wonder then that John Marshall dedicated his important volumes on Sachi to Sultan Begum. She funded the museum that was built there, as well as the guest house where he lived and wrote the volumes. So she also funded the publication of the volumes. So if the stupa complex has survived, it is by no small measure due to the wise decision and to good luck in escaping the eyes of railway contractors, builders, and those looking for finds to carry away to the museums of Europe. So, students, if you remember, when we were studying about the Mohenjo-daro and Harappan sites, many of those sites had been ruined by the railway projects, and whereby these bricks, very strong bricks, very solid bricks, they came in very handy, especially when you read about the Indus Valley sites, where the Multan Railway, and if you remember, even in the Harappan sites, a great deal number of bricks were taken away for those railway constructions. But here, because of the fact that it had these sites had already caught attention of the British and the French archaeologists, and on top of that, the rulers of Bhopal were particularly keen to preserve these sites, and they understood the value of these sites. So these locations and these monuments survive. So in fact, in students, a question had come exactly about this in the board examination for class 12, about the reason why these sites have been so well preserved. So these are important topics. So what is the significance of this monument? Why was the mound mill built, and what did it contain? Why is there a stone railing around it? So who built the complex or paid for its construction? When was it discovered? There is a fascinating story that we can uncover at Sachi, for which we must combine information from texts, sculpture, architecture, and inscriptions. So let us begin by exploring the background of the early Buddhist tradition. uh, the background, sacrifices, and debates. The mid first millennial BC is often regarded as the turning point in the world history. So, students, that's what we have been emphasizing. It saw the emergence of thinkers as Zarathustra in Iran, Kongzi, that is Confucius, in China, Socrates, Plato, Aristotle in Greece, and Mahavira and Gautam Buddha among many others in India. And guys, Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, they are given in succession, because the interesting thing is, Socrates was the teacher of Plato, and Aristotle was the student of Plato. So uh, Socrates taught Plato, Plato taught Aristotle. And interestingly, if I may add here, Aristotle had also been the teacher of Alexander the Great, yes, and Mahavira and Gautam Buddha, among many others. In India, they try to understand the mysteries and existence and the relationship between human beings and the cosmic order. This was also a time when new kingdoms and cities were developing, and social and economic life was changing in a variety of ways in the Ganga Valley. These thinkers attempted to understand these developments as well. uh, the sacrificial tradition. There are several pre existing traditions of thought, religious belief, and practice, including the early Rigvedic tradition known from Rigveda, compiled between 1500 and 1000 years before Christ. The Rigveda consists of hymns in praise of a variety of deities, especially Agni, Indra, and Soma. Many of these hymns were chanted when sacrifices were performed, where people prayed for cattle, sons, good health, long life, etc. So, at first, sacrifices were performed collectively. Later, and that is 1000 years before Christ to 500 years before Christ, some were performed by the heads of household for the well being of the domestic unit. More elaborate sacrifices, such as the Rajasuya Yagya and the Ashwamedha Yagya, performed by the chiefs and kings who depended on Brahmin priests to conduct the ritual. So, students, what they are trying to say is, of course, you have to understand right in the beginning of the chapter, that's what I had said, that India was is a very very ancient civilization, a very very ancient society. You know, everything, when you would start reading in the history books, because you would start reading things about in the history books only ever since it started getting documented. But you have to understand that, you know, documentation does not mean that you've documented something for the first time. That means that happens to be the origin, or that beginning, or the beginning of that particular thing. No, it might be, mm, you know for a very very long time, right, guys, students? It's like when Galileo first saw set his eyes on the planet Jupiter in 1610. I think that was the year. That doesn't mean Jupiter did not exist before Galileo set his eyes on it, right? Because he looked at the planet Jupiter, and then he discovered the moons of Jupiter, and that came out as a startling discovery, because India, I'm extremely sorry, while Earth had only one moon, he could see many many moons of Jupiter. So it was a startling invention or discovery, whatever you may choose to call it. But then that doesn't mean it was not there before. In a similar fashion, once things started getting documented, that only shows that yes, they started getting documented, but they always had been there. In an ancient civilization or a society like India, the people must have been, and the great thinkers, the Brahmin thinkers, they must have been, being thinking about these age questions, as I just said, about your place and my place in this cosmos. Why was this formed? What are we doing here? Where would it all go? Why are we born? Why do we die? These questions have always and always grappled us. And man, the great thinkers, they have always been confronted with this reality in all the civilizations, whether it was Socrates, it was about Aristotle, Plato. Plato came up with, it was Plato who, students, though this is not there in the chapter, because how the historians today around the world still talk about the lost continent of Atlantis. They still try and sometimes say it could be in the Mediterranean there, but that's where it sank. Sometimes they say that yes, it could be in some part of the Atlantic Ocean. All of that and all of that and all of that. But then how did we first came to know about, or rather come to know about, the existence of a lost continent of Atlantis? It is through the writings of Plato. That it is he who was for the first time who actually has documented in great detail about the lost civilization of Atlantis, right? So students, you have to understand, these are all ancient civilizations, you know many of them not documented properly, many of them documented, but those scripts have not yet been deciphered. So that's what you have to understand. Man has been grappling with different questions, very fascinating ones, which today we probably do not have time to find out for, right? Because we have got busy with some other things in life. Yes. So we shall continue, students, tomorrow. We shall continue. Thanks.